So, Chat GPT, it's getting a lot of attention and it's viewed as maybe something villainous and inaccurate, something that can be a great new tool, and something that could be pervasive. Well, maybe it's all those things, but here's the way I think of it. It is not a lot of things, but what it is the equivalent of the sharpened rock. What I mean by that is a brand new effective tool. So when mankind figured out how to sharpen a rock, humankind moved forward rather significantly, right? So here we have a very effective tool. Now, what it's not, as it's called AGI, or artificial general intelligence. It's not a pervasive intelligence that's going to control everything we do. And I'll get into some of the reasons why, but it can be a very specific tool, but in general, it's not artificial general intelligence. It's not intelligence. That's the fundamental point. So when we think about what it is, it's narrow and specific, as I've mentioned. It's not general. And so it has its limitations because there is a process that artificial intelligence goes through where it gets a lot of data and it manipulates that data and gives an output. But it doesn't really understand the context. It doesn't really know how to narrow or what should narrow. It doesn't understand many of the dimensions that we maybe take for granted in how we think and what true intelligence actually is. So there are some answers that are, rather superficial, rather dubious. If you, scan the web, you'll see that it doesn't understand how to value one input versus another if it's equally weighted. And therefore, there's no application to what we would think of as just basic intelligence, where we get an answer that says, well, that's kind of absurd. As an example, it doesn't know whether the Earth is round or the Earth is flat. And if it sees the same data, you can get an answer that says, well, it looks like the Earth can be both round and flat. Well, it's not, right? And there's better data for that. So what it is, it's a statistical engine that searches for patterns, right? So it's very good at that. So within a very narrow field, it can be a very effective tool. And one of the things that, I'm learning from some of the people I work with, and I made mention of, even in systems engineering, and David Martinez at MIT is saying it's the most effective research tool that he's experienced. And other areas, we see it in finance, Bloomberg introducing their GPT tool, other tools within radiology and medicine in general, within science, scientific research, engineering. It can be excellent as a research tool that sees patterns, understands how to collect data, and then that can help a thoughtful researcher and somebody who wants to apply that knowledge with the context and filter of an understanding of that topic. It can help them greatly, which is why it can be a very effective tool in academics, a very effective tool in schools in general. And it's not cheating if you use it right? So it'd say, well, type my essay for me on whatever topic, and it can do that. It can type an essay. But the point is, it can give you information and research, and then you can apply your critical thinking, and it's a more effective way to essentially collect the data you need to develop your own educational and academic experience. That's very powerful, and I think that in general, with all the fear of cheating, and initially there was a reaction where it was banned from schools, I think they're thinking better of that. And I know that, my work at Harvard and MIT, they see it right away as a very effective tool to help students move faster, think more critically, get exposure to more data, and kind of use their mind, in the sense that that's what academics is intended for, right? It's not intended to be rote learning. So now we have a tool that gives us that rote learning. Well, now we've upped the game for everyone. And that's great news, right? But what it's not good at is expressing, I call it, improbable insights. And we can think back in history, and even people like Newton and his laws of motion, and Einstein and his theory of relativity. These were just developed initially with an intellectual perspective and a creativity that no form of artificial intelligence, especially Chat GPT, can ever develop. You can't be creative with it. It can create things, but we're talking about being creative and connecting to knowledge. And I sort of point out a couple of very interesting examples that don't maybe get the most insight, is things like the insight of Clerk Maxwell, who understood electromagnetism. And it's Clerk Maxwell's equations that enabled electromagnetism, electricity, the electrical age, right? So he changed our lives because he understood something with improbable thinking. And I also talk about Max Planck, who basically founded quantum physics and quantum mechanics. And it's that understanding of quantum physics and quantum mechanics that enabled, if you will, the miniature world that we now exist in with microprocessors, et cetera. And it's Bob Noyce, along with Gordon Moore, who developed that microprocessor, and he won a Nobel Prize for this, or Gordon Moore did. But Noyce's insight and creative thinking that said, wait a minute, if we understand all of these elements of physics, we can create a very powerful tool. No AI program is going to do that. And that's the shortcoming. And that's why I say, intelligence is really a sense of creativity, a sense of understanding what is possible, not just doing data analysis and saying, this is what I found, right? So we look at, digging a little bit deeper into that. A prediction, an explanation, and then thinking, right? So, this is an example. This was taken from Noam Chomsky and Jeff Waddimal, who are researchers in this area. Jeffrey, a good friend of mine, he's done a lot of great work in artificial intelligence. And they'll use this very simple example of, let's just kind of say Newtonian physics here, but there's a description, the apple falls. Okay, well, AI can understand that. An apple falls. Then it will look and say, well, I've seen that an apple falls, so if you've got an apple, it will fall, right? So I sort of see data, I can understand it, I can make a prediction. But now make an explanation, right? And this is where the insights, the improbable thinking, as Newton, well, what is driving the motion of heavenly bodies, right? That kind of understanding, that explanation, well, it's because of gravity. Well, there's something going on. There's a cause and effect and an insight. That's where the tool of artificial intelligence can give a thinker the ability to gain an insight. That's the real benefit, but it's not going to give that insight to anybody, right? And I'd say the other great thing about thinking is, we'll call it the counterfactual. And to quote their example, it's like, well, it would not have fallen if not for gravity, right? If I'm holding an apple and it just doesn't just stay there, right? So there's gravity going on. But the counterfactual, of course, is that understanding that, well, is that what really happened? What if that didn't happen? What would the outcome then be? What if this didn't happen? What would the outcome then be? If this did happen, what would the outcome then be? That is real thinking, and that's what humans do quite well. AI can't do that. It can give you a foundation with which to do that. That's why it's a great sharpened rock, but it's a hammer and a chisel to a piece of marble. But you need Michelangelo to create David, and humans are still the Michelangelo in that equation, right? So it can understand what's happening, but it can't give you cause and effect. I should say it describes what's happening, but what's cause, what's effect? One of the great riddles I love is, you'd say, well, AI can look at a fire and it can say, well, maybe fire trucks cause fires, because every time there's a big fire, there's a bunch of fire trucks there, right? So it doesn't understand cause and effect. It can simply describe. There's fires, there's fire trucks. And then that's a bit of data, and it takes that insight to understand, well, I can do a test to see what is really cause and effect. Right? So the other thing that thinking enables us to be wrong. Like, it's really okay to be wrong, and that's how we learn, right? So what Chat GPT does is it memorizes things, right? So it gets back to one of the fundamental criticisms of rote learning is, if you're just memorizing anything, you don't understand anything. There's a great story by Richard Feynman, the physicist. So he went down to Brazil, he gave a lecture in Brazil, and all the students knew all the equations, knew all the data, knew all of this that he was basically presenting. But then when he asked, well, now given these equations, given this, how do you predict this? How do you calculate that? How do you do this? Basically, how do you solve a problem? And they couldn't do it because they had learned and put all their energy into just learning an equation. Well, now I know the equation. If you tell me to solve the equation, I can do that. But that's not how real life works. Real life says that equation is a tool. Maybe it works here, maybe it doesn't work here, maybe there's an exception, maybe there's a way to understand it. And that's what he was really preaching. It's like, well, get your tools together, but now you've got to figure out how to use it, right? And that is what distinguishes us, right? And the other thing is understanding what's possible versus the impossible. One of the things that has been brought up regarding Chat GPT is, we'll call it moral thinking. And this is an indictment maybe of AI in general. But I say it's not so much of an indictment is if you understand what the tool is. Like, the tool is not capable of moral thinking, and it never will be. That's what humans can do. So we can put constraints, we can put whatever limitations we want, we can add additional dimensions. That's our role. That's our role of thinking. And to think that, well, we're going to insert some kind of moral thinking or some kind of filter that gives us a more desirable output, whatever that is, however you want to define morality, but that's a human construct. That's not a computational construct or a software construct. So it's not capable of doing that, right? And so it doesn't think about balancing creativity, with constraint. I mean, there are certain things that we just don't want to do. And I think a great example, if you go back to one of the great innovations of our time, but also one of the horrific developments in atomic weapons, right? So the physicists, these were wonderful, rather earth-shattering breakthroughs, and it was literally earth-shattering, right? So now they understood, they created, this monstrous weapon. And so there's maybe constraint that comes along with knowledge. Humans can apply that. So we can think about limiting nuclear weapons. We can do those things. When you have Enrique Fermi, who started off saying, well, this can be a source of clean power and the world can have clean energy, and wouldn't that be great for everyone? Absolutely. Unfortunately, the constraint that he didn't even realize at the time was, well, we can also blow the world up. So clean power is one thing, but destroying all life is maybe another, right? So we can apply that constraint. AI can't understand those things. So the robot armies are not coming anytime soon, because essentially you have this very broad requirement for intelligence, understanding dynamic systems, understanding, all the way things work, and it takes such an intense amount of information. Like, there's just no way that software takes over the world. I'm sorry, it just doesn't, right? And of course, the other thing that we have that we can battle is we can always have an off switch, right? So we can turn off any bit of software that's running. But more importantly, right, that there are limitations that require, very narrow applications, and it's very good in narrow applications, but it's not general intelligence, right? It doesn't have perspective and experience or judgment. And let's use the example of Newton, right? Where Newton can look at heavenly bodies because he sees the way one thing moves, and he can make a judgment as to how the moon is in one time of the year versus another time of year, come up with a calculation, and then suddenly he's got the laws of how heavenly bodies work, right? Sort of an amazing prediction from data, narrowly applied. Now there's applications for Newtonian physics everywhere, but it still comes from this narrow data set and then perspective and understanding, right? So, and we'll talk about, the dynamic world, and, there's a great example of, self-driving cars, right? So there is a dynamic environment in a car, right? But if you control the environment, let's say you're on a freeway. So on that freeway, you've got a car here, a car there. You can control that and understand the variables and maybe process, and you can have that self-driving car, right? But in a residential street, you've got a very complicated and complex system that's very dynamic. The ball bouncing across the street. Well, is that a ball or is that a child? There's a tree with a branch in the wind. Well, is that an obstacle? And is that a tree branch, or is that a truck, or is that an overpass, right? So there's lots of dynamic environments that AI is not going to be able to process anytime soon. And we're seeing that those limitations are really coming out, that if you want true safety, what's great is a tool that says, well, I understand all these environments, but you still have to kind of be at the wheel. Well, that's what we're talking about here. Human beings still need to be at the wheel, and you're getting better information, and maybe you're a better driver. I think probably with these systems, everyone's a better and a safer driver. That's a good thing, right? But there's common sense versus pattern matching, right? So AI software, it can match a pattern, but it really can't understand how to kind of put common sense and apply things that's going on. We can see a ball and quickly know that's a ball. We don't have to think, well, maybe that's a child, maybe it's not, right? So we don't have to worry about those things, but that's why, common sense really does take over, and why it's more important in thinking about AI as a tool that enables me to be a better thinker, right? So, fundamentally we get to scientific method, which in very simple terms, it's see, test, and verify, right? And so, by the way, this is one of the reasons why there are some things that truly are objectively observable. I can see, I can test, I can verify. A third party can test and verify, right? So this is why we know things, right? So, there's an argument about, well, how do we know this versus that versus that? Well, there are things that we know because we can test it and verify it, right? There's some things we can't know. We talk about issues of spirituality and other things. You can't test them, you can't verify them. But there's a lot of things we can in the material world, a lot of things that we can test and verify, right? And so the world is not random. There are reproducible results. We can understand cause and effect, but the challenge is gathering data. There's a natural limitation to how much data processing and handling that data, labeling that data, understanding what's useful and not useful. This is becoming almost an insurmountable problem. That is scaling up to be very challenging and very difficult. And then when we look at the computing power needed, as I mentioned, just a few years ago, we thought that computing power was theoretical. Well, now we're getting enormous advances in computing power, and now we've got the competition that we love to see, where we've got people like NVIDIA and Google and IBM, and then even China, Japan, these places developing more and more powerful processing and ways to process that information. So we're getting very powerful tools. So that's great. The rock is getting sharper, and instead of a rock, maybe now we're going to have metal and sharpened metal, and now we're going to have even better tools and better tools and better tools. But that is my fundamental point. There's a natural limitation. They are going to be better and better tools, but they're not going to reach the quantum leap that says, well, now they can think for us. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that can happen, given what software can do. It's not intelligence. It's not going to think, and we're going to naturally hit a wall as to what it can do, because we have to apply human thinking instead. Right? So in summary, it works in a narrow and specific manner very effectively, and it will continue to work very effectively. It's not general. It doesn't apply. It's not intelligence, right? It really can't make predictions. It can't explain things for sure. It doesn't understand cause and effect. And then that thinking, which I'm really sort of substituting for creativity, right? Being creative, right? And that is the real benefit, right? And the other thing is our thinking, we can be wrong. We can be wrong with our thinking. We can be wrong in the way we do things. And, the fear of the robot armies, they're not coming, right? And so at the end of the day, we see, we test, we verify. And those objective standards, AI enables us to see. We can develop tests. We can verify the results. That's great. That scientific method will help us. But then being creative, being understanding, knowing how to apply it, that is something that is human and will remain human. And that's the fundamental definition of intelligence. And software is not that. Chat GPT is not that. Artificial intelligence is not intelligence. And certainly there's no artificial general intelligence that I think is reasonable to expect coming anytime soon. And I will say, really not ever.